Hi guys, been a while. So there's a lot going on in the news. You got the Epstein files stuff. You still have more ICE. The dude got killed as we expected. So today I had a thought experiment for you guys. And before I get to that, I want to introduce you guys to something. It's called Null's Law of Media Accuracy. And basically it states everything you read in the newspaper is absolutely true, except for that rare story of which you happen to have firsthand knowledge. So basically what this is trying to say is we as humans, we have a tendency to read things in the paper, and unless, it's obviously ideologically opposed to us, we will tend to accept it as reasonably true. So, if you're, for instance, on the right, a lot of times you'll read a story in Fox News and you'll agree with it. You'll be like, okay, this was probably reported pretty clearly. If you're on the left, you'll read a story in CNN or on CNN or on CBS News, and you'll think, okay, this was probably reported reasonably accurately. And what Null's law states is that regardless of the ideological leaning, regardless of where the reporting was coming from on the political spectrum, that story is probably going to be inaccurate if you know something personally about that story. So this is something that I have personal experience with. I used to work in an industry that received a lot of media scrutiny in the past. And so I would see articles in the online, or I'd see them in the newspaper, and they'd be talking about our industry, and they would be saying wild stuff, things that were absolutely not true, that some things that were just straight up misinformed, like they didn't even have an idea of how our industry worked or anything like that. So that was the example, and that's what really hammered it home for me. I was like, wow, most people know nothing of this industry, but anybody else that's reading these articles right now, because the articles are written well, will assume that what is in this article has some meaning or makes sense, when in reality, neither of that is true. So to illustrate this for yourselves, I have a thought experiment for you. I want you to think about your job or your field of expertise. And it doesn't actually have to be a job. It could just be something like, your hobby, a hobby that you know a lot about, a field of interest that you have read a lot about or have personal experience in, anything like that. So think about that and then ask yourself, how many people out in the world have the same knowledge about that as you do? How many people, if we're talking about a job, actually really know the nuts and bolts of your job, how it's done, why it's done, the processes that lead to it being complete? How many people know enough and have enough practical experience with your job or your field of expertise that they could step into it tomorrow and not just do the job, but do it properly and do it well? Most likely, that's going to be very few people. Unless they've actually worked your job. If you work in fast food, I mean, there's shit in fast food that people who never worked fast food wouldn't even think about. But that illustrates the point of Null's law. Most people commenting on something like ICE. There's ICE is just plucking people off the street at random, blah blah blah. How many of those people really know how ICE selects, identifies, and then finds the people that they're picking up? I had 20, 30 years ago in Southern California, I'd see immigration, come over and pick Mexicans up at Home Depot also, but people on the left nowadays are pretending like that's a brand new thing. This has been going on for a long time. And what it really comes down to is, they don't actually know how ICE does their job. And this goes for, a lot of other things that you see in the news. Most of the people commenting on things, most of the people, decrying things that they see going on, have no knowledge whatsoever of what's going on. They don't know how it's being done. They don't know why it's being done. Go back to your job, your field of expertise. If your job or your field of expertise was controversial, how many of the people out there, raising controversy over it, do you think would actually have a good in-depth understanding of it? Probably not a lot. So that takes us to the next problem. We have a lot of woefully uninformed people who are commenting, raising hell, spreading rumors about things which they're not qualified in any way to be commenting on. Then you have the nature of social media, where the most outrageous takes, the most extreme content gets pushed to the fore, and that ends up being the content that most people end up consuming. So you have outrageous content put out by people who are uninformed, who think they are uninformed, who think they are informed, and that inflammatory, explosive content is the stuff that's coming up to the top and giving the impression that it's credible. The most people are consuming it, and with that impression of credibility, it creates its own false reality that people end up living in. People forget all about Null's law if they knew about it to begin with. And then we add to that the nature of social media, wherein we expect to be able to have reasoned debates about highly complex, controversial subjects in the space of a few sentences, maybe a few paragraphs if you're lucky. And what you end up with is this simplified parody of discourse that ultimately leads to a simplified parody of our own opinions and judgments. So I guess to bring things full circle, what I'm saying is everybody needs to be aware that you're probably far less informed about what's going on in the news than you actually realize. Think about your job, think about your field of expertise, think about all that knowledge that you have about that field of expertise, about that job, that everybody else doesn't. When we are looking at a story in the news, to go back to ICE, most people have basically zero idea of how to do that job. So yeah, none of us are immune to it. When you make your judgments, you need to realize, hey, I'm probably pretty uninformed as well. And maybe I should temper my opinion until I have more information. Or maybe I should delve into this a lot more. Maybe I should talk to some people that are affiliated with this field before I go locking in my opinions on things. I may not know how things are actually working. I may not know how this is actually done. For all I know, this thing that I'm upset about is a normal procedure that has very valid and normal reasons for it. But that's it, man. So think about it. Like I said, do that thought exercise. Have your family members. If you have a very contentious friend or family member, you might try it with them and see where it goes. You never know. If you don't, get yourself a dog. If you don't have any contentious friends or family members, get yourself a Chihuahua or something. Get yourself a Husky. They'll argue with you all day. Anyways, have a good one, guys. Later.